For most people living in the Middle Ages, life was a constant fight for survival. Every day brought new challenges, from unpredictable weather and failing crops to deadly diseases and violent conflicts. Unlike today, where food and medicine are taken for granted, medieval peasants had to work tirelessly just to secure their next meal. Life was harsh, unforgiving, and often short. Survival wasn't just about avoiding disease or danger, it was about scraping together enough food to sustain your body through backbreaking labor. For the poorest, this meant a monotonous diet of whatever grains, vegetables, or foraged foods could be found. Luxury or indulgence was a foreign concept. Even a small loaf of bread could mean the difference between life and death. In this video, we're going to uncover the darkest truths about medieval hunger, how famine gripped entire regions, pushing people to extremes, and in some horrifying cases, even cannibalism. This isn't just history, it's a story of human desperation, resilience, and the brutal reality of survival in a world without safety nets. Life for medieval peasants was grueling, monotonous, and defined by hard labor. Most of the population lived in rural areas, tending small plots of land owned by a local lord or monastery. Freemen, a small privileged class of peasants, might own or rent land and enjoy relative independence. But the vast majority were serfs legally bound to the land they worked and forced to give a portion of their produce to their lord. Daily life meant endless toil. Fields needed planting, crops required tending, and animals had to be fed. Many peasants supplemented their meager diet with foraged foods, wild berries, herbs, nuts, and occasionally small game, but these resources were scarce and unreliable. A poor harvest could mean weeks of hunger, and famine was never far from anyone's mind. Even when food was available, it was repetitive and nutritionally limited. Grains like oats, rye, or barley formed the backbone of the peasant diet, often boiled into watery gruels or thickened into pottages with whatever vegetables, legumes, or scraps of meat could be found. Every meal was a reminder of the struggle to survive in a world where every day was a battle against starvation. The Great Famine of 13,151,1317 was one of the darkest chapters in medieval history, a devastating period that left millions of Europeans starving. What began as relentless, unseasonable rain quickly destroyed crops across much of the continent. Fields that once promised food now yielded mud and rot, and grain stores were emptied in weeks. Cattle disease added to the disaster, wiping out up to 80% of livestock in some regions. Without animals to plow fields or provide milk and meat, communities faced a crisis of unimaginable scale. Bread, the staple food of peasants, became scarce, and the simplest moleils, a thin gruel, or a slice of rye bread, were rationed to near nothing. As hunger intensified, social order began to crumble. People abandoned villages in search of food, while others resorted to desperate and horrifying measures. Chroniclers of the time describe scenes that are almost unimaginable today, families scavenging corpses from graveyards, and in the most extreme cases, instances of cannibalism. The famine didn't just take lives through starvation, it eroded morality, shattered communities, and left a permanent scar on the European psyche. During the Great Famine, the daily struggle for food became a brutal reality for medieval peasants. What was once simple poverty now turned into life-or-death desperation. Their diets, already limited, shrank even further. Peasants relied on whatever they could grow, themselves: roots, cabbages, turnips, and the occasional grains. Gruel, a thin, watery porridge made from oats, rye, or barley, became a staple. Its tasteless, nutrient-poor consistency was barely enough to stave off death. Pottage, a stew made from vegetables, and occasionally scraps of meat or fish, provided some variation, but ingredients were scarce, and meals were often diluted beyond recognition. Bread, the staff of life, was rationed strictly, and rye bread, the coarse bread of the poor, became a survival tool rather than a comfort. Anything edible, acorns, chestnuts, or even foraged herbs, was ground into flour to stretch meals further. The desperation drove people to eat what we would now consider inedible, blurring the line between sustenance and survival. Starvation pushed the limits of human endurance, making every meal a small victory. Even the simplest oatcakes, baked on hot stones in the absence of ovens, became precious commodities, offering a few calories and a brief reprieve from the relentless hunger. As the famine dragged on, desperation escalated into horror. When crops failed and livestock perished, some communities faced starvation so severe that social norms and moral boundaries began to collapse. Historical chronicles from Ireland and parts of France describe a grim reality. People resorted to cannibalism to survive. Bodies were reportedly exhumed from graves, and the flesh of the dead was consumed. Mothers, in their utter despair, sometimes resorted to eating their own children. These accounts are chilling reminders of how extreme hunger can strip humanity down to its most primal instincts. Cannibalism wasn't just an isolated act of madness, it reflected the systemic failures of medieval agriculture and governance. Continuous rain, crop blights, and disease among cattle decimated food supplies. The famine of 13,151,017, known as the Great Famine, left tens of thousands across Europe starving, desperate, and willing to cross unimaginable lines for survival. Even in less extreme cases, the poor scavenged whatever they could find: roots, bark, and even leather or clay mixed into food to make it stretch. Every morsel became a battle against death, and morality became a luxury few could afford. The Great Famine of 13,151,017 was one of the darkest chapters in medieval Europe. Unlike localized food shortages, this famine swept across entire regions, affecting England, France, the Low Countries, and parts of Germany. It began with relentless rain in the spring of 1315, which ruined the planting season and turned fields into muddy wastelands. Crops failed, and the following years brought little relief. Livestock succumbed to disease at alarming rates, wiping out as much as 80 of the animals that peasants relied on for milk, meat, and labor. Without cattle, the soil couldn't be plowed effectively, and the food shortage spiraled further out of control. Grains became scarce, bread prices skyrocketed, and the basic sustenance for peasants vanished almost overnight. Reports from the period reveal staggering death tolls. Starvation claimed hundreds of thousands, and communities were left in a state of chaos. Markets collapsed, and trade routes became unreliable, leaving even towns with relatively stable food sources in peril. The famine reshaped society. Villages were abandoned, peasants fled to cities, and the social fabric of medieval life began to fray. For those who survived, life became a daily struggle. Families scavenged for anything edible: roots, tree bark, and even the inedible remnants of previous harvests. Children, the elderly, and the weak were particularly vulnerable. The Great Famine didn't just kill, it left scars on the minds and cultures of the survivors. When famine struck, survival demanded desperate measures. Peasants scoured forests for roots, berries, and herbs, risking their lives for scraps. Even sacred animals were hunted, while stale bread and husks became precious meals. Families stretched every crumb soaking bread, boiling roots for hours, rationing food so at least one person might endure. Monasteries and wealthy neighbors offered some relief, but supplies quickly vanished, leaving most to face hunger alone. And when ingenuity was no longer enough, starvation drove people to acts that shattered all social and moral boundaries. In the Middle Ages, famine blurred the line between survival and despair, revealing the true horror of hunger. When famine reached its peak between 1315 and 1317, desperation drove people to unthinkable extremes. Chronicles from Ireland, France, and Germany describe horrifying scenes of cannibalism acts, born not of choice, but of sheer survival. Some dug up graves to eat the dead, while others, consumed by hunger, turned against their own children. The Great Famine shattered entire communities, erasing moral and religious boundaries. Cannibalism wasn't common, but its very presence revealed how brutal conditions had become. These accounts remind us how thin the line is between civilization and chaos, showing that when food and safety vanish, even the strongest social bonds can collapse.